Good afternoon, everyone. This is the Spartan. I wanted to talk to you today, this afternoon, about shaping operations and and what I think is going on in the Ukraine conflict. Now, I did post a video earlier in January where I indicated that I felt that the Ukrainian armed forces should be attacking their main vector of attack, which should be in the Kherson region. Since then, obviously, a lot has changed, specifically the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam, and it's been weighing on my mind listening to experts and pundits and online commentators and that sort of thing, how they seem to have just written off the potential for the Kherson region to still be a viable and possibly the best option for the upcoming counteroffensive or offensive. I hate the term counteroffensive. There's no offensive going on by the Russians right now. They're in a defensive posture. The Ukrainians are attacking. This is not a Ukrainian offensive. So, to start with, I wanted to first talk about what was considered a shaping operation. And I found many different definitions of shaping operations. I did come across a thread by John Spencer, who kind of gives a good definition of a couple ways of looking at shaping operations. So for those of you who are not reading online right now, what is a shaping operation? As well as we all eagerly await Ukraine's coming offensive. He also says offensive. I like that. I've heard different sources try to identify or call potential shaping operations, signifying an early phase or beginning of the offensive. But let's agree on what are shaping operations. There are two common military ways to use the term shaping operation. First, in the context of operations such as battles, the U.S. Army has a shaping, decisive, sustaining operations framework. Provide a broad process for conducting operations, the plan, arm design methodology, MDMP, troop leading procedures, prepare, execute, assess, operational framework, areas of operation, combat power, warfighting functions. That's not what we're talking about today, but that's some good information. A shaping operation is any operation that creates and preserves conditions for success of the decisive operation through effects of the enemy, other actors, and the terrain. An example could be destroying enemy supplies ahead of an attack. Shaping operations set conditions. This is the most important line for me. Shaping operations set conditions for the success of the decisive operation. Basically, what this means is anything that you do, from psyops, physical, military equipment, troop movements, using the press, using the media to your advantage, attacks, feints, withdraws, terrain, etc. All of those things fall into this, and many more that I haven't mentioned. But shaping operations set conditions for the success of the decisive operation. A decisive operation is the operation that directly accomplishes the mission, such as destroy the enemy or seize terrain. The other ways many people use shape is in a broader context, such as shape and operation environment. These shaping activities can include security cooperation, military engagement, and forward presence of forces, usually in pre-conflict phases, like the joint phase, shape phase. And again, that I'm not going to go too much into the details of that, but that falls under the umbrella statement above. In Ukraine, any of the daily operations, in fact, could be shaping operations. I also like this line. In preparation for the decisive main goal mission, operation of the offensive. It is a pretty simple idea. So there's, and again, you can. I just thought this was fairly comprehensive and broad ranging, and gave you a good sense of what a shaping operation is. A shaping operation can be dropping artillery in one spot to force troops away. It can be leaving. Not dropping artillery in a certain area and making it appear to be a path of safety for advancing or retreating troops, etc. There's so many things that fall into shaping operations. So now let's go back to the biggest shaping operation of the conflict to date, although we may be in another one. But this is basically, if you look at the green areas and assume that they were still Russian controlled, this would be your late summer, early fall map ahead of what was one of the greatest shaping operations in modern conflicts. So just to recap again what happened, and I'm not going to go into the deep weeds of it, but long story short is the Ukrainian military was obviously arrayed over here. The Russians were on the right bank or the west side of the Dnieper River, and the Ukrainians made it be known through troop concentration, through artillery fire, other types of fire, and more specifically through public warnings. They made it be known that they were going to be taking the Kherson region. And again, remember, at the same time, most of the Kharkiv Oblast was occupied by Russian. So what did the Ukrainians do? I always remember, and it always stuck out to me because it was so out of character for them, but I remember at the time in late fall, where the Ukrainian armed forces, the Ministry of Defense, put many broadcast messages out, basically telling their citizenry in the Kherson area to get to someplace safe. I can't remember the exact wording. I didn't bother looking it up because I would have gone down a rabbit hole. But basically, they told their citizens in no short order that this was not a safe place to be. This is where the attack was going to be taking place, and to find shelter or safety. I think that was actually the term they used, shelter or safety. So what did the Russians do? The Russians said, "Oh, I see. You're going to be attacking the Kherson region. So what are we going to do?" And they started peeling their forces from all sorts of areas, but specifically the Kharkiv area, and brought them down by train to the Kherson region. Military equipment, reserves, active frontline forces. They basically thinned out all of their lines from this area, probably assuming that there was not a large concentration of Ukrainian troops there. It was close to the Russian border, ergo it could be easily reinforced. And they wanted to basically go strength on strength and come down here to the Kherson region and take on the Ukrainian forces. As we all know, this was a massive feint and an intelligence coup by the Ukrainian armed forces, because not only did the Russians bring everything that they could scrape up down by rail to the Kherson region, they actually brought them across the Dnieper River and placed them in the Kherson area that they occupied. So what did the Ukrainians do at that point? Without getting into the absolute TikTok, they basically started to trap those forces on this side of the river by pockmarking every single bridge. The Antonovsky Bridge, the road crossing of the Kakhovka Dam, the rail bridge, any bridge that they could easily move, especially heavy equipment across, they started to punch holes in it with HIMARS. Not completely destroying the bridge because they wanted foot traffic to be able to go back the other way, or light traffic, but they wanted to basically trap all of the heavy equipment and as many people as possible on this side. And then the offensive happened in Kharkiv, and they basically hammered along a large line of the Kharkiv border, occupied border, until they found a spot where it was going to break. And when that spot broke, which I believe was right here, all of the Ukrainian forces, especially the reserves that had been quietly and secretly moved up into this area, flowed through there, and you started to see the thunder runs, and you started to see 17,000 kilometers, square kilometers taken in a matter of days. To the point where they had to stop where they ended up stopping because they either ran out of logistics, fuel, supply lines, ground lines of communication. They just took too much territory and they had to consolidate. And then what continued on in the Kherson region? Well, they continued to basically just absolutely decimate these troops, stop their supplies from coming in, pockmark the bridges, etc., to the point where the Russians brought in a new commander, battlefield commander, who basically made two decisions that were highly impactful and probably saved Russia a lot of lives and gave them a lot more breathing room. One, he made the decision to withdraw the troops over the Dnipro, and two, he made the decision to create all of the fortifications. It wasn't just brilliance. He's also a very strong ally of Prigozhin, and Prigozhin apparently made a lot of money on Dragon's Teeth and some of the fortification building. But you can see basically none of this existed. These 3, 4, 5 layers, these rings around cities, that sort of thing, none of this existed prior to that commander taking place. So that catches you up to basically what happened to make all of these, what were red areas, green and Ukrainian occupied territory. Now, jumping forward to recent history. Prior to June 6th, prior to the Kakhovka Dam being destroyed, I listened to time and time again, night after night, and again, not to say they're wrong, but night after night, listened to person after person after person basically state that the place where the attack is going to happen, and this was prior to June 6th, but the place where the attack was going to happen was going to be basically in kind of like a pie shape, if you want to call it that. No, not really a pie shape, just we'll call it this trapezoid. So this was the area that basically every pundit and every expert online said somewhere, somehow, the attack is coming in this area. Why? Because of the fact that it would cut the land bridge from Russia to Crimea, because it was a short path from Ukrainian-held territory to the coast. And on top of that, people would say things like, well, because of the fact that the bridges are blown across the Dnieper River, and the Ukrainians won't cross the river to complete an offensive maneuver in a large scale. It's much easier to align your forces here and here and here and basically drive down to the coast, cut off the land bridge. I've heard people make comments like, well, this is a large river. And I would counter that by saying, well, if you're competent to move Humvees, APCs, tanks, etc., across any body of water, whether it's 100 feet or 1,000 feet, it takes a lot of the same efforts. You don't want to lose your tank traversing a 100-foot reservoir or river, and if you've prepared to be able to transfer that equipment across 100 feet of water, as long as that water is not fast moving, you can transfer that same equipment off across 1,000 feet of water. Obviously, the longer the distance, the more at risk you are and the more vulnerable you are to enemy fire, etc. But the process, the logistics, the equipment required, the training required, the preparation required does not change, no matter how wide the river is. On top of that, the Ukrainians have proved time and time again that they are able to cross rivers at will. they've crossed rivers that nobody expected them to. They've crossed during the day. They've crossed at night. They've crossed under complete cover of darkness unexpectedly. They've crossed during the day under fire. They've crossed during the day and not had any fire directed at them at all. Surprisingly, in there's just so many examples of the Ukrainians being able to cross large, medium, and small bodies of water with equipment, with troops, a lot of them, and Severodonetsk and Lysychansk and places like that, and cross multiple times and do it when the enemy expects it and do it when the enemy doesn't expect it. So the argument that the Kherson region prior to January 6th was out of the equation because of the fact that it's, air quote, a big river, does not hold water, pun intended. Now, why do I feel like everything that's gone on up until this point is potentially the largest shaping operation of the war, including the Kharkiv-Kherson feint? One, and in no particular order, but one, President Zelensky and his generals decided to defend Bakhmut as opposed to abandon it. I think they made a couple of calculations. The main calculation being they knew that Russia wanted Bakhmut, and they knew that they had a chance to take out a disproportionate amount of Russian regular forces troops, VDV, Spetsnaz, and Wagner. Because of the fact that it was the holy grail for Putin. He had originally, rumors had it, he had originally offered to pay Wagner for taking Bakhmut. And from that point on, through the entire war, literally the first shell launched or dropped outside of the borders of Bakhmut over 14 months ago, I believe it was. So Zelensky and his generals basically looked at that and said, if you want it, we might give it to you, but we're going to make sure you pay an extremely high price to take it. And because of the fact that the Ukrainians were entrenched in buildings and able to move and leave and retreat slowly at their own pace and blow up buildings behind them, and knowing that the Russians, and specifically Wagner, who are basically the most elite troops in the Russian military since the start of the war, and definitely now, had to leave cover and move from building to building, street to street. And the Ukrainians could blow up those buildings, target those streets, have coordinates pre-programmed and pre-disclosed to artillery. So when a Wagner unit or a Russian unit crossed intersection X or entered building Y, they either had it wired to blow or could tell the artillery, time to hit this coordinate, time to hit coordinate Z, whatever, because of the fact that that's where they were. So that was the first shaping operation. They knew that they would draw in the elite troops. They already had some elite troops there, and they knew that they could bleed them for a long period of time and retreat on their own as long as they could keep the highway of life open. Two, and again, this is in no particular order, but shaping operations involve things very obvious and not so obvious. And to me, I've always believed, I've always wondered and believed that the Russian freedom fighter incursion into the Belgorod region was not to take and maintain large swaths of territory and, liberate and create the Belgorod People's Republic. I personally believe that the attacks across the border region up here were meant to both distract and to peel away Russian assets and resources. Whether it's Wagner, the Kadyrovites, the regular Russian troops, ISR, etc. And it worked. They've brought Russian troops up there. They've brought Kadyrovites up there. They've distracted from some of the more pressing targets in the south and east portions of occupied Ukraine. And then in no short order, and in no particular order, the Ukrainians began to counterattack in Avdiivka. They counterattacked on the flanks of Bakhmut. They have done probing, reconnaissance by fire, attacks, if you want to call them that, and taken territory in places like Vuhledar, Velika Novosilka. Let's just do this right. So Vuhledar, Velika Novosilka, and south of Ornikiv, and southwest of Lubkove, right? So these are all of the various obvious points of attack, probing, reconnaissance by fire that the Ukrainians have undertaken over the past week and a bit. At the same time, or just prior to that, and this all feeds together, the Russians blew the Novokakhovka Dam, and they basically flooded the Dnipro River and the river basin. 75% or 72% of the flooding was on the Russian-occupied side. 28% was on the Ukrainian-occupied side. And it took approximately 5 days for the river basin, for the reservoir, the Dnipro reservoir, to empty out and flow like a normal river. So it is now basically, with no impediments, flowing down through what used to be the reservoir and down the Dnipro. But the day that the dam was destroyed, and every day since, 99% of people online have basically said, well, there goes the Kherson offense. There goes the Kherson attack. There goes, it's just not possible. It's flooded. The shorelines will be muddy, that sort of thing. What I would say to you is, yes, the low-lying areas on the left bank or the east bank, depending on if you're facing downriver, it's the left bank. If you're looking at it on a map, it's the east bank. The east bank of the Dnipro and the Kherson region is muddy, is flooded, but I would challenge and say there was no way that the Ukrainian armed forces, prior to the dam being blown, were going to attack across the Dnipro River into a low-lying, potentially muddy floodplain, an area that was going to flood on a regular basis on its own anyways after heavy rainfalls. If the Ukrainians are going to and were going to attack across the Dnipro River, they were never going to be going for something that was a low probability of being dry and able to sustain some sort of amphibious assault, medium equipment, a lot of troops, that sort of thing. There was no way, shape, or form that they were going to risk it on a floodplain. So what you're left with at that point, in my mind, is that the Ukrainians were and are going to attack across the Dnipro River. They have waited for the floods to recede. It's now a regular flowing river, but the areas that are most likely to be a river crossing opportunity for the Ukrainian military never changed as far as the dryness of the land, the elevation of the land. They were not negatively impacted by the floodwaters. And what do I mean by that? So the Ukrainians are not going to throw a pontoon bridge up and start chugging Leopard 2s across as the lead element. The Ukrainians are going to put special forces across the river, and this is not OPSEC. This is not giving away OPSEC. They've been doing it the entire war. If anybody believes that me saying that the Ukrainians are going to put special forces on the other side of a river hasn't watched the news, because hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Russians have been killed by Ukrainian special forces, and hundreds of targets have been picked up by Ukrainian special forces, getting across waterways all through the Ukrainian battlefield. And as of 24 hours ago, it appears special forces made their way somewhere across into Kharkovka and have got into gunfights with the Russian forces. So I'm jumping around a bit, but to back up just one step, about 48 hours ago to 72 hours ago, I can't quite remember when the first announcement was that we heard, the Russians basically announced, and also mill bloggers and through intelligence reports from the Ukrainians, basically identified the fact that Russian forces had assumed, have made an assumption that the Ukrainians are no longer going to be a threat coming across the Dnieper River in the Kherson region, and they have started to move those forces up into the areas where the Ukrainians are currently probing and attacking and making a lot of noise and taking some villages. So as the thumbnail shows, if you start at the top and think, okay, so the Ukrainians have succeeded in pulling forces up into the Belgorod region. Then they've succeeded in pulling and keeping forces in the Bakhmut region. And then they've also brought forces into the Yaselivka region. And then they've definitely fixed the forces that were all aligned in the most heavily fortified area of the entire country, which basically is from Orikhiv over to Vuhledar. And on top of that, there are intelligence reports out that the Russians have sunk 90% of their available reserves. They have 10% of the available reserve forces left, somewhere spread out in the southern parts of the oblast, right? And nobody knows exactly where they are, but Ukrainian intelligence reports basically say they have around 10,000 troops-ish available down here waiting to figure out where the actual attack is coming from. And at the same time, they're pulling over excess troops from the Dnieper, like I mentioned, and pulling them over here either to join the reserve forces or to join the fight. So if you look at it, if you just basically step back and look at it for a second, every single thing that the Ukrainians have done, from the defense of Bakhmut, from the invasion of Belgorod, from the probing attacks, has succeeded in pulling Kadyrovites and Wagner and VDV and Spetsnaz and Russian regular troops all up this way, wherever it happens to be, from Lysychansk, to Orikhiv. Where have those troops been coming from? Those troops have been coming from the Kherson Oblast, and possibly, if there are any troops in Crimea. That brings me to my next point, both for Crimea and for the Melitopol to Mariupol corridor, if you want to call it that. What the online experts, military experts, YouTubers, ex-military, current military, news organizations, etc., what everybody wants you to believe, and I'm not saying that they're wrong, but what everybody wants you to believe is that the Ukrainian forces are going to basically attack into the teeth of the most heavily fortified and heavily staffed areas of the front line. If you look in this direction right here, going south towards Melitopol, in between Orikhiv and Melitopol, and I've seen some people literally draw a straight arrow and say just a straight shot down to Melitopol, and then you go left, you go right, and that'll be great. Well, if you pick the wrong area, and trust that the Russians know where the wrong areas are, but if you pick the wrong area, you could literally be going through 7 or 8 lines of fortifications between the current trenches that they hold, the minefields, the anti-tank trenches, the second level trenches 4 to 6 kilometers back, the Dragon's Teeth, plus the artillery fire, and knowing that there are natural obstacles or paths that either prevent the Ukrainians from easily traveling through those areas, or they're left open so that the Ukrainians will travel through those areas. It starts to become a little more daunting if you look at it. If you step back and just look at this picture and say, are the Ukrainians really going to fight their way tooth and nail through all of this? And then to get to a city that is, by all accounts, I've heard people say that they're going straight for Tokmak. Tokmak is also defended and surrounded by Dragon's Teeth trenches, tier 4 trenches, whatever you want to call them. It's not quite as bad on the Mariupol side of things, but it is still fairly bad. And then if you go over and you look at the deep state map and you just include the Russian forces and you look at the density of the forces that they have around Bakhmut, Avdiivka, and the Mariupol to Melitopol corridor, if you want to call it that. This is the majority of the Russian military in country right now. And as we said, probably there 10% of the reserves that are left are probably left in this area, ready to pounce on the spot where the Ukrainians break through. Flip side, here's where my opinion comes in. There's 2 areas that are completely understaffed and do not have anywhere close to that level of fortifications. Come on. Come on. Come back. No, that's not. Where did my map go? There it is. If we back this out a bit like this, let's see if I can just get it to the right spot here. Okay. So we know for a fact, based on recent intelligence, that a good chunk of the troops that used to be in this area have been pulled out and moved over to here. We also know that in northern Crimea, there is kind of like a gray area here where there are a couple of land crossings, and there are next to no fortifications and next to no troops in that area as well. So if you look at the troop density, if you look at the fortification density, and you back all the way out and think, okay, how are the Ukrainians going to achieve a couple of their goals? One, they definitely want Crimea down the road, and everybody has basically said Crimea is last, except for the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians don't say what order anything's falling in, but a lot of the experts say Crimea will be last. 2, the Ukrainians want to cut the land bridge from Russia proper through to Crimea and then back through to Russia again. Those are the 2 goals that they want to achieve. Well, wouldn't it be possible? Wouldn't it be amazing? And wouldn't it just throw all of us for a loop if they got all of the Russian troops to move out of the way, and then based on using the media's own bias against them, and using the Russians' own stupidity against them, were to put a couple of thousand special forces across, let's say in probably not Novokakova, but probably in Antonivka, in and around the northern Kherson city proper region. Wouldn't it be amazing if the Ukrainians were able to, or another spot where you've got a fordable river, like crossable river. But if you were able to put a couple of thousand, couple of hundred special forces into a very underdefended area and start to take large swaths of land, knowing that the vast majority of the Russian defenders had already moved out, and you were able to give yourself a 20-kilometer buffer zone, let's say, around an area, right? Around, the old bridge crossing that had been taken out, whether it's the rail bridge, whether it's the old automobile bridge. If you were able to create that buffer zone very quickly because of the fact that you're encountering no resistance, then all of a sudden your bridge laying apparatus comes into play. Then all of a sudden, the boats, the pontoon, the moving pontoon bridges, etc., come into play. And then all of a sudden, you're able to bring across not just Humvees, but MRAPs, and working your way up to tanks or whatever. And then you're going to start to expand that area. And now the Russians have two problems. They've moved the reserves and the primary forces over to the Zaporizhia and Donetsk Oblast, and their back door has been left open, and you've got a bunch of Ukrainian special forces. And by the time you've heard about it, mechanized infantry, not only threatening, but across the Dnipro, multiple bridgeheads created, and they have basically a straight shot and relatively undefended shot down to Crimea. And Crimea right now has a lot of fortifications built. They do not have any troops down here. If you look at the troop allocations on Deep State's map, which is not to be, it's not gospel, but it's pretty close. There's a sprinkling of troops defending what is hundreds and hundreds of square kilometers, thousands and thousands of square kilometers, actually, sorry, hundreds of straight line kilometers, but thousands of square kilometers. There is nobody in Crimea to make note of, like nobody. So why, I ask one more time, would you sacrifice men and machines, etc., to plow your way and grind your way through there when you can probe and look for a break and potentially take advantage of it, but at the same time, like the U.S. did with the Iraqi left hook, make everybody believe that this is your primary goal, your primary offensive target, and at the same time, do what you were going to do before the flood happened, and now that the flood waters have receded, you're basically in the same boat to do it again, pun intended, which is to pull your own right hook and come in behind them and cut off the land bridge from Russia to Crimea and force these people to try to get back onto trains and try to come back again. And this time you're entrenched, you're waiting for them, and they're the ones that are exposed and traveling. That is what I think is going to happen. I really honestly believe that's what's going to happen. And I'm going to be watching and waiting to see if it actually does. And if I'm right, it doesn't make me an oracle. It just makes me someone who is a student of Ukrainian behavior. And I just ask myself, what does everybody expect the Ukrainians to do? Then what's the opposite of that? Because that's probably what they're going to do. So anyways, I appreciate any likes, shares, comments, rebuttals, arguments in a polite, nice way, but arguments, telling me I'm wrong or pointing out some flaws in my logic. But anyways, that's it. I just wanted to get that off my chest, get that documented, and now I can sit back and watch the show and see if I'm anywhere close to right. So that's it. Thank you for listening. Have a happy Friday night. We'll talk soon. Tell someone you love them. Slava Ukraini.